Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode in a new series that I'd like to call My Thomas Opinions. To start off this series, I've decided to show my favorite episodes of Thomas and Friends. These episodes are a combination of nostalgic classic episodes from my childhood, as well as some modern CGI episodes. Now, let's get on with the topic that you all clicked the video for. The hit entertainment era was full of mediocre to straight-up terrible episodes, but Squeak, Rattle, and Roll managed to stand out among the rest and earn itself a spot in my top 10 list. This episode is full of nostalgia from me, as I grew up during the days of the airing of Series 8. I love Gordon's character in this story. Even though he feels his days are numbered, he still presses on and delivers the Fat Controller and the children to their ship on time. Diesel is also wonderful in this episode. He poses a real threat to Gordon. His inclusion in this story seems to really match up with his classic series character. Now, there are a few things that keep it from being higher on this list. Diesel had done things like this in the past, and wouldn't Gordon know not to trust him? I digress. Also, why is the Fat Controller in Gordon's cab? Besides those nitpicks, this is a wonderful episode and definitely deserves its spot on my top 10 list. This is the first of a few CGI episodes on this list. Henry Gets the Express seems like a story straight out of the books. Every character in this story is used to their full potential, and well, they're in character. Henry, Gordon, the Troublesome Trucks, and even the Brendan Docks gang feel so natural in this story. Henry finally has an episode with his classic persona. The interaction between characters is also well done, and it seems very natural, as I said before. Comedy is also very effective in this story. There are several lines that made me laugh. Here are just a few.
Coal trucks?
Sorry.
Oh, the indignity.
Stinky Express coming through.
Also, Scarloa and Rheneas appear, so that's cool. This episode stands proudly amongst the rest and definitely deserves a place in my top 10. Next up is a simple story from Series 6, A Friend in Need. I've always loved the pack, and I can't think of a better way to introduce them than the Season 6 two-parter. I placed this story above the first one, but they're both amazing. The construction yard sets are wonderful, and the story is played out in a very realistic way. The climax is very dire, and I find myself rooting for Jack every time I watch the episode. He is so determined to do a good job so that he can stay with the pack. Every character seems to be very fleshed out, and they're all interesting. Jack is determined, Alfie is the best friend anyone could have, Oliver is very helpful, Isabella is proud of her paint, Max is a real bully, Kelly is very mature and the most experienced, and Ned is clumsy. Thomas is great in this episode as well. It seems in character for him to care about the new guy. In all, this is a very solid episode and definitely deserves a spot on my top 10.
We're a cracking crew, laughed Kelly.
Come on, don't be silly, puffed Henry to the freight car.
The Flying Kipper is a beautiful little story from Series 1. The plot of this story is quite simple. Henry takes a fish train and gets into a crash. What makes this episode so great are the outstanding visuals. I love the nighttime sets in this episode. Just look at this shot. Everything in this episode is done so realistically, especially the crash. Heck, this crash is based on a real accident that occurred on the Great Northern Railway in 1876. This accident was caused by a signal failure, similarly to the crash in the episode. When Henry returns after his rebuild, you can't help but feel so proud for the big green engine. After all he has gone through in the previous episodes, it is so surreal to see him so happy and well. Truly a great way to honor such a beloved character. Geez, I wish Mattel could do the same, don't you? Anyhow, the Flying Kipper is filled with amazing visuals and an amazingly realistic crash. An episode definitely worthy of being on this list. Henry's Hero is a newer episode from Series 17, and stars, you guessed it, Henry and Hero. My thoughts on this episode are similar to Tug's, so I'll keep this brief. Go check out his video if you haven't, it's definitely worth the watch. What makes this story stand out among others is that it's such a different type of story. There are two flawed protagonists. After taking on a bad lot of coal, we can see each side of the conflict through the two characters. Henry is concerned about his health, but Hero is determined to get the job done. Both are fine stories, but when they're combined, it is definitely something special. Both characters have flawed thinking, but they're also both right. The moral of this story is so two-sided, it makes you really think about the complexity of this type of narrative. Even though being cautious is all well, it's also important to press on despite the difficulties. Due to this episode's interesting and unique style, it definitely earns a place on my top 10. Haunted Henry. Yes, it's another Henry episode, but come on, this one's just fantastic. The mood is what makes this episode so wonderful. Everything is just so creepy. The cinematography, the fog effects, the music, and that freaking owl. My gosh, that thing is scary. This episode is so mysterious, and I love how eerie it is. The story starts with Edward telling Henry this myth about an old line that is never seen beyond this episode. After a series of spooks, creepy sights, and a ghost, we reach the climax as Henry's trucks crash into a landslide. We then meet the ghost, and I love that it's some random human character that we never see again. Once Old Bailey's station is restored and shown properly, we can see just how beautiful the set really is. Due to all of these exclusive sets and characters, as well as the eerie atmosphere, it's definitely worth being on this list. A MostSingular Engine is another CGI episode from the 21st season. In this one, Diesel tries to force Daisy and Harvey to become enemies, but when in the end, the two unique engines become the best of friends. A simple plot, but the characters are used to their full potential and work so well in this story. Harvey has never been paired with any specific engine before, and Daisy seems like the obvious first choice. Daisy's episodes in this era never cease to be amazing, and this one is no exception. I love that Diesel tries so hard to make the two engines enemies, and it is so dang satisfying when he rolls into the sea after his plans fail. The music is outstanding as always, and I always die of laughter when Harvey and Daisy first meet each other and the Eye of the Tiger sequence plays. It just feels so right. In all, this episode has perfect music, comedy, and character use, and it definitely deserves its 4th place spot. Heart of Gold. Yep, I chose a Blubber episode for my top 10 list. Not only is Heart of Gold my favorite Blubber episode, but it's also my favorite episode of the entire CGI era. This episode is just, well, perfect. Toby is so much in character here, more than any other character in any other episode in this era. After being made fun of, he is so determined to stop the thieves. Speaking of thieves, I'm honestly surprised that Mattel let Michael White write an episode about this topic. thieves are a real thing in our world, especially around museums. After the tourists make fun of Toby, it's so nice to see them praise him despite his looks. Unlike most episodes in this era, the moral is not shoved down in our throats. It's nicely disguised into the story. You can be useful despite your looks. Unfortunately, there is a dream sequence in this episode, but it's not nearly as bad as some. In fact, it kind of reminds me of the dream sequence in Calling All Engines. In all, this is the best Boba episode of the show, and it definitely deserves a place in my top 10.
Silly steamies, I've never read a book in my life.
Gordon and Spencer. As some of you know, Season 7 is my favorite season of Thomas and Friends, and Gordon and Spencer is the best of the bunch. This episode is so nostalgic to me. New Friends for Thomas was one of my first VHSs, and I always fast-forwarded to this episode. Even though Michelangelos narrated the episode on the VHS, I do prefer the US Michael Brandon dub. Brandon is one of my favorite narrators, and this episode is definitely one of his bests. I know Hartshorn might not be as well known as Mike and Jr., but come on! The music in this episode is wonderful, and as I said as I was discussing Squeak, Rattle, and Roll, I love Gordon's new series theme. Speaking of Gordon, we have to talk about the rivalry between him and Spencer. These two engines are cousins, and I'm so glad that the writers introduced such a rival for the fastest engine on Sodor. Gordon and Spencer's characters just work so well together. It's also worth noting that Spencer is one of the few characters introduced around this time to still be used today, not counting that stupid reboot that's airing later this year. He's been used so much that his rivalry with Gordon only ended in the 21st season, 14 years after he was introduced. The visuals in this episode are great as always. I love the lighting in Series 7, and Spencer's face masks are just hilarious to look at. In all, Gordon and Spencer is truly a great episode, and it definitely deserves its number 2 spot in my top 10 list. Now, as you can see, many pictures are appearing on your screen. These pictures are episodes that I like a ton, but they didn't quite make this list. These episodes are listed in production order, and not necessarily how I would rank them. There are a lot of them, so you can pause or slow down the video if you really want to get a good look at them. And now, the moment you have all been waiting for. The time when I reveal my favorite episode of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. It comes from a simpler time in the franchise, back in 1986. The best episode of Thomas and Friends is Old Iron. There are so many great things in this episode, it would take hours for me to explain it all, so I've condensed it to 4 major points: nostalgia, realism, music, and character use and development. I have so much nostalgia for this episode. Just like New Friends for Thomas, 10 Years for Thomas was another one of my first VHSs. I fondly remember watching this VHS back in the mid-2000s every day for hours on end. Unfortunately, my childhood tape was destroyed by the VCR, but luckily, I've picked up a few more copies in recent years. Second, everything in this episode is so realistic. It's just wonderful. I love the grimy sets of Series 2, and they really work well in this story. The chase scene is pulled off wonderfully as well. It looks so dang real. Every second of this episode looks so real that you could imagine it happening on a real railway. A driver falling ill, boys playing on a steam engine, and an epic chase scene that wears an engine out. Next, I've gotta mention the music in this episode. Every theme in this episode is just beautiful. I love Edward's theme, James's theme, and the Runaway theme. I love just how seamlessly James's theme leads right into the Runaway theme. The ditties in this episode are great too. Every piece of music adds something special to this episode, and without them, this episode would definitely not be my favorite. I can't talk about this episode without mentioning the character use. Each character is used so well and fits perfectly into their part of the story. Thomas and Percy stand up for Edward. James is boastful as always, and is the perfect engine to become a runaway. This certainly isn't the only time he's become a runaway, but it certainly is one of the best. Edward is such a perfect character to place in this story. He is the oldest in the main fleet, and of course he would have a nickname like Old Iron. His determination to rescue James is so awesome to see, and I freaking love how quick James is to regret calling Edward names. It really shows how much respect and friendship every character has in this series. So, that's my top 10 list. Please leave your thoughts in the comments if you agree or disagree with my list. I'd love to hear them. Also, tell me if y'all like this style of video. As I said at the beginning of this, I have a ton more topics I'd like to cover in this little series. See you around, guys. Peter out.